Hello and welcome to Cambridge, Massachusetts. Tonight we have a very special guest. Tonight we're with Susan Crawford, and Susan Crawford is a visiting professor at both Harvard Kennedy School and the Harvard Law School. And she has a very colorful life that we're going to talk about later, that goes from California to Cambridge, Massachusetts. But in all this process, I know that you have been thinking a lot about the law applied to the digital world and the online world. And I would like to start by asking you the following question, that is, the internet now is something that is so ubiquitous that it has more or less become a right. But this is a right in which the public option is not yet clear. So I would like to ask you if you could explain us a little bit of why the public option is not clear, how a public option for the internet would look like, why would we need the internet to be universally accessible and whatnot.
The internet, access to the internet, is the basic global communications network today. It's the replacement for the telephone. And for people all over the world, having access to the internet makes it possible for them to get access to markets that are far away, work with their friends on very creative new businesses, get rid of gatekeepers of all kinds, intermediaries who otherwise would be responsible for publishing things and taking a long time to take a slice off the top of whatever new business or new idea you had. All of that is gone, as is all the borders around the world for the internet. So the internet is the most empowering development of my lifetime. It's the most exciting thing. Internet access is the centerpiece for 21st century life right now. But what the engineers didn't even imagine when they came up with the internet protocols was that the people who provide us with internet access, the telephone companies, would ever have a say in who gets access to the internet, what they get to do while they're using the internet, how much they have to pay for internet access. They would never have imagined that. In fact, the guy who invented packet switching, Paul Baran, tells this famous story that he took the idea of packet switching to AT&T just to let them know about it. And they said, son, that's not how a network works. Because for the phone company, the only kind of communication that makes sense is one that's completely controlled from the endpoint to the endpoint. So there's a dedicated circuit, and they're able to charge perfectly for it, whatever they want to. They couldn't imagine that packets could make their own way around the world. Well, what happened about 10 years ago is that the telephone companies and everybody else providing internet access woke up. They woke up and they said, how is it that all these new businesses are being formed using our lines? That doesn't make sense. And so they came up with this story, which is that we won't build high-capacity pipes for people to access the internet unless you let us discriminate, choose which communications do well and which do badly. Let us decide what neighborhoods to serve so that we get to charge rich people a lot of money for internet access and leave out the poor. They made a deal with our government here in the United States that was, you deregulate us, lift all kinds of obligations from us, and we will in exchange build internet access for you. Well, the first part has certainly happened. We got rid of all the rules. They can cherry pick neighborhoods, they can decide who gets what service. The second part hasn't. So there are 100 million Americans who still don't have internet access. And for rich people, it's getting more and more expensive, and there are local monopolies that I'd love to talk about that control wired internet access. And for poor people, there's often no access at all. So unlike water and electricity and the Postal Service, for which we have a public option, we have the idea that all Americans should have access to these things, we don't have that at all for internet access. It's a purely private product. It's like going to a first-run movie. It's expensive and it's rare.
And in the internet, you can ask yourself the following question, because the content of the internet is not provided by the telcos that provide the network. But people go to the internet to access the content that is actually provided by other people around the world. So in some sense, the content that is what brings you to the internet is something that is not provided by the ones that are charging you to access the internet. So is in that case someone that is a little bit appropriating from a value that was created by someone else? How is that fair?
Right. Well, the great way to see if I can do this with two mental pictures for you. One is that for a telephone conversation, the telephone company isn't allowed to charge you based on how interesting your conversation is, or how much money you've made during the course of that conversation. And that's because we had this idea that telephone networks are public goods, that they make possible so many good things for society, that if we allow one private company to appropriate all the value from it, that actually will undermine the social fabric for the entire country. So we regulated the telephone companies and said, no, you don't get to choose conversations. You just charge a basic rate for connectivity, and that's it. Here's another mental picture, which is, imagine a river, just water rolling by a village, and everybody gets to dip into the river and take what's of value to them and use it for making cakes and doing all kinds of other things. For internet access, it's as if we've let a few companies build enormous dams and flywheels, water mills, and they're making all the money off of that rushing river, and the rest of us are left without.
So, so now that we have like these analogies and we understand that there is people that might be appropriating value that is generated more collectively on the internet, I want to ask you a little bit of a different question, but it's very much related, which is 20 years ago we wouldn't have been having this conversation. Okay, 20 years ago the political issues, where like you always talk about education, you would talk about health, you would talk about national security or gun law, or maybe being pro-choice or being pro-life. But now the internet has become a new political issue, and I was wondering if you think that this is a political issue that now is just in the beginning, is a political issue that is is heating up. Are the people in Washington actually aware of the power that it has, or the influence that it has in young voters? What do you see about the internet as a political issue, as something that would change the decision for someone to vote?
Well, actually, I disagree with you. I don't think it is a big political issue yet. I think it will be. I think it will be. And I have great hopes that especially our students will take this on as a central political issue. Everybody should be elected to Congress based on whether or not they understand the importance of its utility to American life. Right now, it's not even brought up in debates. It's not part of the political conversation. The centrality of the internet, the necessity of it to be inexpensive. It's not even relevant. And that's because, sorry, go ahead.
So, but although at the same time, soap and pipa were an example of an issue in which many congressmen changed their decision very quickly, which I don't know if I could name many other examples that would have such an ability of changing, the decision of congressmen. So that's why I was saying an issue that now is becoming more important, that is starting to show their weight, and maybe I agree with you that maybe in the higher spheres is not recognized as an important political issue, but among the citizens, would you say that maybe it is recognized or it's becoming recognized?
Well, there's not much awareness yet of how much power the local carriers have and how few carriers we're depending on for internet access and how much they're gouging us. And Americans are not quite aware of how much better internet access is in the rest of the world. We're not a curious country for some reason. We don't care how good life is in South Korea or Japan or the Netherlands. If we could bring that picture home and help people recognize for internet access what they're missing, how much better things could be, then I think even other generations, beyond the very young people, would understand how central this is. Sopa Pipa, I hope, was a great turning point for this kind of issue, in that it indicates that there are a lot of young people who are galvanized by any attack on the internet. The problem with internet access as an issue is that it's so incremental. There's no sharp crisis. There's no moment where you say, oh my God, the world's falling apart. It's just bad. It's like global warming as an issue. We know the summers are getting warmer. We know that humans are contributing to this. But it's hard to visualize it. It's hard to understand how any one person's actions could ever have an impact on it. And we're in the same situation right now with internet access. There's a little bit of it in the United States. For rich people, there's quite a lot. And yet it's not visible yet as an access issue.
So you mentioned during your last set of points that people did not understand, kind of like, we didn't have a clear picture of what's going on in Japan or in South Korea or in the Netherlands. So maybe you can help us paint that picture. You can help us tell us how is the internet different in other places, and how did these places implement a better internet?
Well, we're at this very interesting moment around the world where the old copper wire phone networks are reaching the end of their useful life, and they don't carry enough bandwidth for internet access to be capable of carrying video and making, lots of real-time interactions possible. So other countries around the world have said, oh, we need to replace that copper with fiber optics that have essentially unlimited capacity for all kinds of human interactions online. So they've made that choice as a matter of industrial policy. They just say, look, we needed clean water, we needed electricity, now we need fiber. And that's happening all over Asia. So China has decided that 300 million Chinese people are going to have access to fiber in their homes by 2015. That's a very ambitious agenda, and probably it's only because they're an authoritarian country they can make it happen. But even in democracies like Japan, South Korea, Netherlands, it's a choice by the government to make sure that their citizens are able to participate as effectively as possible in the economy. The story that may make Americans pay attention is Australia. They're a lot like Americans. They drink a lot of beer, they're cheerful,
They play weird sports.
They play some weird sports, and we understand each other. And the government of Australia has decided that 93% of Australians are going to have fiber to the home. And the government's funding it. They're making sure that there's a basic fiber network connecting everybody in place of that old copper phone wire. And if they can do it, that's a big blank country. There are a lot of holes in the middle of Australia. Surely the United States, which should be number one in internet access, should be able to have this series of thoughts. It's an essential utility. We made a mistake by deregulating it. We've got these monopolies now that are controlling access. We've got to take a different approach because we're falling behind. We won't be the place where the new Google, the new thing that requires instantaneous real-time human interaction online, is going to be developed. It's not going to happen here because there won't be a big enough market inside America for those things to be tested.
And so then what's the way forward that you think that actually because in a way we can all agree that maybe we're not in the ideal position, and that there's a better world somewhere out there, but if we're going to get there, we're going to have to get from here, so we're going to start from here to go there. And my question is, what's the path that you see, or what are the first steps? Maybe the whole path is too ambitious, but what are the first steps?
The first steps, luckily, are upon us. There's a crisis, which is that already 4 states in the United States have decided not to provide phone access to absolutely everybody in the state. They've said, oh, there's a competitive market. We don't need to make sure that the poorest in our state actually have a phone. They'll get cell phone access. They'll pay for this somehow. This is a disaster because there are a lot of elderly people, people in rural areas, poor people who only have landline phone and don't want to have to pay for some private service that doesn't guarantee them access to public safety. Right now, using a landline, you can reach 911 easily, right? And you can always be connected to the rest of the world. Imagine giving up on part of your citizens in a state. This crisis gives us an opportunity to say, all right, we're getting rid of the social contract for communications. How can we do that? And to help everybody understand that the next network, the basic network, is fiber access to the home, and that we should be making sure that every American has that at a reasonable cost. So I'm hoping that the first step is, oh my goodness, we're leaving Americans behind. Second step is, and wow, it's really expensive. Why is it so expensive? I'm paying more and more and more for cable service. Third step is, people are going to recognize that the phone companies have gotten out of the business of taking care of wires and providing internet access. That really, we've got a cable monopoly in 22 out of 25, the largest American cities. There's one company providing cable access. And they can charge whatever they want. No one tells them what they're doing. So when people realize that cable is now in charge, they already hate the cable companies for lots of reasons. They're very expensive. Then they get upset and they start electing people on this basis, saying, we've really got to rework this. We've got to rethink what it means to be one country. We can't be getting rid of our phone system, our postal system. What's next? Water? What's next? Public schooling, electricity? And we'll have a change in mindset that's going to happen over the next few years.
So communications is a public right, we can say, But let me put a different argument. Let me be like contrarian, not because I think contrarian, but just to kind of like stimulate the conversation, which is, well, food, eating is a right, but, actually market don't have problem providing food, so the food actually is not provided by the state, and we all agree that everyone, needs to have access to food. It's a very basic thing. So why would, the market not work in this case? What is so particular about, the internet and why would the market would not work in this particular case? There must be some market failure, some nuance that maybe you can tell us about.
Oh, it's a great question, because food is not a natural monopoly. So let me explain how this works. What's interesting about telecommunication systems, just like water, electricity, is that it costs an awful lot to build them initially, right? So it really only makes sense to have one of them in each community. You don't have two water systems, you don't have two electrical systems. There's one provider.
But you have 100 restaurants,
you
exactly.
Have 100 restaurants, and they all survive because the barriers to entry, that's why the economic guys would talk about it. Lots of people can enter to compete. With this kind of commodity thing, like water, electricity, telecommunications, it doesn't make sense to have a lot of competitors. It actually is only fruitful for one actor to show up. And the companies know this, and so what they've been doing is consolidating, because it is so expensive to try to compete. They've given up competing, and they've just consolidated. And so we have all the downsides of the natural monopoly, which is one actor in each community providing us with wired access, and none of the oversight of that monopoly. No regulation, no consumer protection, no requirement that it be provided on for a fair price or a reasonable price around the country. So it's a very different, these natural monopolies with high upfront costs, it costs very little to serve one additional customer. So it actually makes sense for them to have enormous scale. So they're very, very large companies, very expensive to build, almost impossible to compete. And yet we're treating them like a normal market actor, which makes no sense.
So let's move now away from the electrons and away from the photons and into the bits, because obviously the internet also has kind of like this non-physical side, and we have been talking mostly about the physical side. And let me tell you a story that I heard not so long ago from a very good and reliable source, in which a good friend of mine was talking with someone, and I'm not going to name names, so I'm going to say that someone that was head of search at an important search engine. Mm-hmm. And he was talking about, search at another, even more important search engine. Yeah. And one of the things that they say is like, what the problem is for us is that even if we would have exactly the same algorithms than this other more superior search engine, we wouldn't have the data that we would be required to train those algorithms in order to provide the same search results. Mm-hmm. So in some sense, we're never going to be able to compete at that level because there is an advantage that is all of the data has been accumulated prior, and that would be required to provide like the good search results that are needed. Yeah. So now we also see that maybe would that be a natural monopoly? Do we have monopolies that are emerging also on the side of the bits rather than on the side of the atoms?
It's a great question. I tend to treat the sidewalk and the conversation above the sidewalk as two very different things, because when you're sitting in your living room, you can only get access to the physical wire that's coming into your house. When you're sitting in front of a screen, you can click over to another search engine. The switching costs are invisible.
Yeah, but if the other one cannot provide you an inferior service, comparable service, because it doesn't have access to a resource that is private and cannot be, so there's a barrier to entry that is infinite because, there's something that is.
I find that's, for me, harder to conceptualize because that data could be gathered by the second competing search engine.
If it had the volume, but in order to have the volume, it has to have the quality, so there is a chicken and egg.
It's a chicken and egg thing, but also they could be building relationships with all kinds of other actors who could give them access to data and a better algorithm. I used Alta Vista for a long time, and then I switched to other search engines. It cannot be that the search engines are not going to be knocked off their perch.
So you would argue that in general there cannot be natural monopolies on the bit side, even if it's a social network, even if it's none of those.
Well, there are network effects that are very difficult to overcome, and if you've brought all your friends and all of your communications tools into one or two baskets, maybe the switching costs then become higher. But I still believe that because it's physically easy to exit, these things are different in kind as well as in quality. that the infrastructure barriers are so much higher than the bit barriers. I can imagine if the kids who started Diaspora at NYU are, persuasive, there are going to be a lot of people who get freaked out by Facebook in the next few years who will exit, no matter how many friends they have tied up with that network, to go to another place that has similar affordances and a different list of people. They'll just leave. So for me, that means that Facebook and Google and Microsoft are all overturnable in time.
More than the service providers of
yeah.
internet connectivity.
Right.
So tell me a little bit, so all of these things, I've heard through the grapevine that actually there is a book about them that is coming out soon. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh, thank you for asking that question. I have a book called Captive Audience. It's coming out in November 2012 from Yale University Press. It uses the lens of the Comcast-NBCU merger to tell this story. How we got here, how we got from the place where every American has a phone and it has the same quality of service and it connects us equally to the world, to the place where the rich have second-class internet access, which is cable access, almost nobody has fiber access, and the poor are left behind. How did we get there? And I wanted to explain to as many people as I could how important this story is and how Comcast and Verizon on their side are really battling with the internet. Comcast is in charge of the internet in the places where it operates. It gets to discriminate, choose whoever it wants to serve well. It's a gatekeeper beyond any gatekeeper we've known today.
It's like, now, we talked a little bit before that the internet is a political issue that has not become too salient yet.
Not yet.
It's not yet recognized. So there are some political issues that are very classic, and we would immediately know what is the stereotypical response of, the GOP or of the Democrat.
Right.
So for example, we say, well, GOP would be, pro-life, Democrats would be pro-choice.
Right.
That's, very, very stereotypical response. Now, when it would come to internet access or when it comes to like net neutrality, how do you see those lining up? Because maybe we're not yet sure what are the positions of, and I was wondering if you had any at this point would be predictions, of how would you say that they would align?
Oh, it's a great question. I think right now we see the GOP lining up with AT&T and Comcast because they're very well paid, frankly, by the carriers. But there's a historical story here that indicates that this is actually a bipartisan issue. At one point in 1904, let's say, 1902, both very progressive farmers and rock-rid Republicans were furious at the railroads and furious at other privately controlled utilities that were dictating the terms on which the free market could operate. So if you're a farmer and a railroad is not regulated and can charge you whatever it wants to let you get your goods to market, or if you're a Republican sitting in New Jersey who wants to be able to turn on a light switch and is being gouged by the local utility, both those groups can be angry. And at about that point in the early 20th century, we had a tremendous progressive awakening as both the left and the right, for their own reasons, recognized that their world was being controlled by these giant providers of commodities. And they actually rose up and elected Teddy Roosevelt. He actually comes into office in 1901. And they go after the railroads and Standard Oil and the light utilities and everybody else, saying, no, you've got to serve the public. You're a monopoly provider of a commodity service. Fast forward now, I do think that eventually, I hope, the Republicans will recognize that this is a free market issue. That if you don't have a predictable, low transaction cost network to address with your business, you're actually cutting down on the market that you could reach with your thing. And just because a few companies are now reaping enormous rewards by monetizing access, that's not good for you, the small business or another actor who would like to have a reliable sidewalk on which to operate.
And then now going a little bit more into the bit side again, but like let's say colorful bits. Actually, like Soap and Pipa was not so much about like wire providers of electrons and photons, but it was actually much more about like the industry that generates content like movies and this type of content that is protected by copyrights and intellectual property. So, and we haven't talked about that, but obviously it's one of all of the players.
It fits all together.
Yeah, so it's one of all of the players. So now I wanted to ask you about then, what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts of how should we rethink copyright, intellectual property in an age of the web? We're making it, for example, as we record this is a Creative Commons license that is available to everyone, but obviously, I'm not making a living out of the show. It's kind of like a public service. There's other people that actually make a living out of that, and they need to reconcile the necessity to actually have some sort of control with their content, with the fact that by its nature, information nowadays is extremely easy to copy and replicate. So how do you see that reconciliation happening? What do you see that's going to be that landscape going forward?
So interesting. So copyright has, you can imagine this as a series of circles. We online as well as everywhere else, we want to make sure that people who directly infringe copyrighted materials, that is, who themselves copy for money to take advantage of someone else's work without permission, that they are liable. And they are. They're liable online, they're liable offline. What's happening right now is that the content industries are trying to expand the scope of liability, the circle of actors that they can hold liable, to include general purpose platforms that do nothing but make possible file trading and sharing and copying of information. And one of those general purpose platforms is, in fact, the internet, which is only good at copying. That's all it does. And so they're trying to figure out ways to expand who they get to go after when they're upset about copyright infringement. It's like the Staples commercial with the great big red easy button. An easy button for going after infringement is going after a giant platform like Google or the old Yahoo or eBay or an internet service provider and saying, you're liable if you don't act proactively to protect our stuff, to keep our files from being traded on your network. Do you see how pernicious this is? Because these general purpose platforms were not volitional. They had nothing themselves to do with the copying of material being carried out. They're very far away from that actor that decided himself or herself to make a copy. But they're big targets, and they have lots of money, and if they get scared, they'll start shaping their platforms to serve the interests of this one industry, the content industry. So that's what Soap and People was about. It's trying to expand the scope of liability so that intermediaries like Google, that's sort of jargon, but people in the middle, like Google, would have an obligation to act as a kind of private police for the content industry. All of these issues fit together because the ultimate private policeman is the carrier. It is Comcast or Verizon. They're also doing a lot of copying and letting stuff flow through their pipes. The trade-off in the past for being what's called a common carrier, for just letting stuff flow through your pipes, was that you didn't have any liability, right? Because you're just like a truck. You're not actually doing anything. Now these guys are all editing. They're acting like a first-run movie, saying, no, we're just a private business. We're not a common carrier. We actually have choices about what we allow to flow through our pipes. That carries with it a tremendous risk of liability. So the end game, where everything is heading, is that Hollywood holds hands with the very concentrated ISP industry and also with national security. And all three of these actors have an interest in a very controlled internet that serves surveillance in the name of copyright policing, and a thoroughly monetized and controlled internet experience. So for me, all these things fit together, and I'm really worried about the future of the internet all over the world.
And how do we then go from, because one thing is copying a whole movie. So
Yeah,
there's a movie that someone did, I copied completely and I watched the movie. That's one way of infringing copyright, but another one is there's remixed content that has like a piece here, a piece there, a piece there, has a little bit of a song, maybe makes reference to a character, that was, that appeared originally in a copyrighted material. And how do we reconcile that? Because remixed content, there is a component of creativity and there is value added in the creation of new remixed content. So would it be possible to have a world in which, we have IP and remixed content, or do we going to have to renounce it in order to unleash the creativity? Or how do we protect the creativity, while protecting IP? Are there things that are irreconcilable? Or?
I don't think they're irreconcilable, but the status quo now is that a lot of little copying, the sort of the mice, they just happen. And they happen, and actually the content industry doesn't really care, to tell you the truth, because they're just popularizing their fan base, keeping everything going. It's great for them. If we have a world in which digital copying can be perfectly tracked, where deep packet inspection works perfectly, where you know exactly where every image has come from, and the carrier and all these actors can watch for that, then even remixing becomes impossible or illegal, or even all the mice can get caught. Right now, the elephants, the copiers of entire movies, are relatively easy to find, but the mice are very difficult to find. What I'm worried about is that we'll squelch a lot of creativity and kind of burn the village, to say that, by making sure that everything is perfectly tracked and even tiny instances of copying can be
Would the cost of tracking everything because you can estimate a cost of like tracking everything, would it be lower than, or would it be comparable to the value that you would be saving? In a way, like there is something that there is a cost implied in tracking all of this,
right.
And at the same time, well, you're saying that this is because there is some value that has been misappropriated, so that's why you want to track it, but it could be that the cost is more expensive than, the sickness.
That's true for all of these debates. That's what's so interesting. And in fact, running a neutral network that doesn't try to monetize everything is probably cheaper than trying to choose content and decide what goes first and what goes second. But that kind of calculation, that kind of high-minded, what's more valuable to us calculation, is very rarely done by companies that are afraid and are trying to meet quarterly, targets. They want perfection in tracking and are not actually interested in the long.
The thing is that the company is making the calculation in its own internal circle, but not in the larger circle. So if they can increase their circle and the global circle gets smaller as a consequence, it's still good. From a profit maximizing mindset. I'm not saying that they all have a profit maximizing, but the ones that would do, like value and profits, obviously, they're not perfectly aligned.
And it's more of a religion, often, that's our stuff. You're taking our stuff. It's a very old-fashioned kind of moral rights approach to copyright, that you're actually stealing from me, almost like you've unlocked my house and taken things from me, if you borrow a couple of frames from a movie and remix it into something else. And what we've done over the last 20 years is propertize the idea of intellectual property so that it actually feels to the content companies like a tangible object that's been taken from them, over which they really think they should have control. And the consequences to the world and to society, be damned, that's not their concern. They're trying to maximize their own return. That's not evil. It's just that the perfect storm now of the ability to track things much more precisely in the digital world than we could in the offline world is irresistible to them. The idea of knowing exactly what's going on.
Can I ask you one more thing, and then and then we move to the next section? But and this is a completely off the blue question, so I don't know if you have an answer. But how were these things on the past, like the times of Shakespeare? When he was a content producer, we can argue. Obviously he was a content producer. How was it at the time? Was a content producer that basically by creating a play, he would get compensated in the play, but if someone else goes and creates a play because they read the script, obviously he probably would not find out. And what were the attitudes at that time about, like the value that content producers should be able to appropriate? One thing is the one that you generate, the one that you get to appropriate. How were things reconciled at the time?
Well, copyright doesn't even start until we have the printed book and the idea that the publishers wanted to control distribution of their stuff. So it's always been about distribution, controlling distribution of objects. That's where copyright comes from. And in the past, and actually even now, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. We all constantly appropriate, notice, remix in our lives. There's no such thing as a brand new expression.
So it's like what comes out is that I think now to round up kind of like the whole story, because we started in the beginning. So there is content that is being generated by some set of people somewhere, and there's people that consume content sometimes to regenerate more content and whatnot, and there's people in between. and sort of like, I think the people were concluding that the people that maybe is producing the content don't have a problem that the other people is consuming the content, but the ones that are in between, and usually is where the appropriation mostly happens, and that's where we have problems when it is about moving atoms and, you know, electrons, or, you know, photons, or like moving, you know, let's say like the physical aspects of the web, or when it comes to, you know, move bits, or when it comes to, you know, move books.
Yeah,
Would that be a summary, a little bit of?
It's a little bit of a summary. I think as a political reality, what's happened is that a few industries have enormous political power, and one of them is the content industry, which is one of our greatest exports as a country. You know, the image of America created by...
But is it the content creator or the content distributors?
Well, they're allied, if you think about it. The distributors have enormous interests in keeping a subscription-based pipeline alive, where they can keep charging people month by month for whatever they consume. So when it comes to the IP carriers, the Internet Protocol carriers in America, they have interests that join with the IP creators, the intellectual property creators. And all of them want to keep a completely controlled channel that can be perfectly charged for, so that users are always perfectly price discriminated with. That's a model that makes sense for them. It's not a model that makes sense for the rest of society, where all these, you know, spillover effects are so important, where we hear something, we read something, we reincorporate, we communicate with people around the world. It's a wholly different approach to life that the 21st century now has. But we're able now, because of very concentrated control and access, to reify, to make real, a physical control over intellectual output, which is just unthinkable, actually. Imagine having one actor in each community dictating what information can be shared, not just movies, but what newspapers, what data, what letters, what phone calls. Imagine handing all that power over to a single actor, and imagine what that makes possible for the moneymakers on the other side who want to be able to sell their movies and music reliably. That's the dilemma, I think.
So I think that's an excellent way of wrapping up the discussion, and then I want to go into the next section, because I want to talk a little bit about, you know, obviously all of these topics were topics that, you know, are about relatively new technologies that have emerged, and as I mentioned in the beginning, you know, I know that you started in California, and now you're working here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, you know, thinking about these topics at the Harvard Kennedy School, at the Harvard Law School, and I would like to learn a little bit about how that trajectory went, you know, so why don't we start, like, you know, where did you grow up, and, you know, like how was that childhood like, what were kind of like the things that kind of like entertain you and passion you when you were a kid?
Well, Cesar, I was supposed to be a violist. I started life as a violinist most of my life. My parents are both composers. Oh. And my father's a professor of music, and he actually taught here in Wellesley. And my parents, when they were young, Cambridge was their home. My dad got his doctorate here, and my mother's a singer, and he wrote a lot of pieces for my mother, and they performed all the time here in Boston. They loved Boston. And my father is a very shy man and ended up not getting tenure at Wellesley, which was a terrible blow for my family. And he ended up in California. So that's why I grew up in California.
Where in California?
I grew up in Santa Monica, but my father was quite kind to us, and he was actually teaching at UC Riverside. It was a tremendous thing to give up so much of his life in commuting back and forth. He did that for us because Riverside has terrible air, and my mother's a singer. And he wanted us to grow up in a place where she would be able to sing. So he drove 70 miles out into the desert to teach at Riverside and ran the contemporary music program there, and chairman of the department, and did a lot of composing himself. So after 25 years in Los Angeles, my parents retired from Santa Monica to Cambridge, showing that weather isn't everything. And my father, and they rejoined the magical group they'd sung in 30 years before, and my dad went to the Harvard Institute for Learning in Retirement, which is a wonderful place where people teach each other their subjects. And my mother's here now. She's a composer too. She's having a lot of works performed. She just wrote a big book about emigre musicians who went out to Los Angeles, fleeing Hitler. So she was able to put her whole life as a musician into context out in LA and write about people who found themselves in that strange land from Germany and from all over Europe, and made a beautiful life out of it. She found herself in a very strange land. She missed the East Coast enormously. So anyway, that's my context of growing up. I'm a kid musician, and I played very seriously all the way through high school. I went to Yale, where I played the violin all the time. I was a musician.
And when you went to college, you were thinking of being a musician? Music all the way.
I played 2 places: the Eastman School of Music, where I was accepted, and Yale, which has a wonderful music program. And then I had to decide. And I decided that the deal I would make with myself is that I would practice just as much, but go to Yale. Okay. And so that's what I did. And I then went to graduate school as a violist in New York. And then I became worried about supporting myself. And so I decided to go back to Yale as a lawyer, as a law student, only because I could get into the law school. I couldn't get into the medical school or something else. So I had 7 years in New Haven playing in the undergraduate orchestra. Okay. And so a lot of chamber music. And then I had to make a living, and so I became a lawyer. But the story for me has been a lot of music, plus finding my way through many different jobs. And great advice that I understand the Harvard Business School students were given this year is quit often and quit early. And that's what I've been doing. I've been quitting lots of jobs, and I've ended up here. So one of the jobs that I quit was being a law firm partner at Wilmer Cutler, now Wilmer Hale, one of the fanciest law firms in the country. And I was one of very few women partners there, and they gave me great training. And I feel very privileged to have been a lawyer there. But life is short, and I decided I wanted to be an academic. And by that time, I'd been introduced to technology and the internet. I was one of the very early internet.
Yeah, how did you get involved in law and the internet? I think that's an important context given what we talked about.
Yeah, well, that's how it happened. My second year summer, in law school, one of my friends got me a job at the New York Times as an in-house lawyer there, and I loved the New York Times. And the oldest lawyer there was a guy named Truman W. Eustace III, who had 3 golden retrievers and lived in Greenwich. And he was doing the intellectual property work for the magazines at the New York Times. And so I decided that my route back to the Times would be to become an intellectual property lawyer. And it never actually happened. I didn't make it back to the New York Times, but that became my interest, and that has led to everything else. So I joined a very small firm out in California right after I clerked and graduated that published The Computer Lawyer, called Blank Gilburn. Miles Gilburn ended up running AOL, being way up in the executive suite, and they were one of the very, very first computer software copyright law firms.
Oh, okay.
So that's where it all started, my interest in technology and computers. I come to Washington and I become a technology licensing lawyer, initially IP related, intellectual property related. And then the internet comes around when I'm a young associate, and I get involved in lots of different things. I got involved in the work that led to the formation of ICANN, the domain name people. And I was a privacy lawyer for Yahoo in Washington, and I did work for AOL, just this very early stuff that was happening. And then when I left the law firm, I had quite an expertise, frankly, in early internet stuff and privacy.
And probably there was not a lot of people with that expertise.
Not a lot of people with that expertise, and I also just loved it. I remember the first time I went to an online site, and it was the Spot. The site was called The Spot. It was a Santa Monica beach house. Right. So you know why I visited that, because I'm from Santa Monica. I want to see what this was like. And I felt as if the back of the computer had fallen off. It was like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It was just magical. I couldn't believe that you could do this from your desk. So that drove my interest in the internet. I was lucky enough to meet a lot of the early engineers and people who explained to me how it works. And I think a lot of young people today don't even think about that, what the protocol is, why it's different from the telephone system, what makes it possible to have no boundaries and to work in this almost magical way. So I was lucky to have all of that explained to me at a pretty early time in my career. Then after I left the law firm, I was chosen to join the ICANN board, which is a tremendous privilege, sort of like the only thing on the landscape working on internet governance. And along the road, I became very interested in what the telephone companies thought that they had to do with the internet, because I'd come from the internet side, and they thought they had some role to play. I said, no, you're just the commodity transport provider. What's going on? And that led to 10 years of work understanding the regulatory world for the telephone companies and now the cable companies, and being quite worried about the future of the internet in contrast to the profit maximization plans of the carriers. So I became a professor at the University of Michigan Law School. I then was suddenly asked to help run the FCC transition between the Bush FCC and the Obama FCC. I went to Washington saying I would do anything to help the President Obama. I was so excited that he'd been elected. And I worked very hard on the transition. And I told the transition team that I didn't want a job in Washington. Very sincere about that. I moved a lot and I wanted to be teaching. And I got this opportunity to work on the National Economic Council staff, and I'm still very grateful to Larry Summers for hiring me for that staff. He was the director at that point. And there was a slot for science, technology, and innovation policy. And I was given that slot on the staff. And so for quite a while there, I was the technical person in the White House. We didn't have a chief technology officer yet. The agencies weren't really going yet, and Congress had appropriated $7 billion for broadband access in America. So I elected myself, essentially, to help figure out how that money was going to be spent and help the agencies create the grant program for the $7 billion. So that was quite an experience. Working on the White House staff was a great honor. I learned an enormous amount. And I didn't want to stay in Washington, and so I left and came back to academia. Now I'm here at Harvard.
Oh, very nice.
So that's the story.
It's a very long story. And
it's
what's
a
next?
Long story. I've quit a lot of jobs. I really have. Well, I'm trying to help the Harvard Kennedy School start a program in technology and governance.
Is it easier than in the White House, or?
It is easier than the White House, actually. It is easier than the White House. It's also an honor. And I love working with students, so that's a lot of fun. And now I'm trying to be a public advocate for internet access in America. I feel because I have no commercial money coming into me, no money from Google or anybody else, and because I really care about this issue, and I've had these 10 years of understanding how we got to where we are today, I feel almost as if I have an obligation to explain it to people in the simplest terms possible. So I'm doing that at the same time.
Well, that's wonderful. So we look forward to actually learn more about all of the lessons that you have, and I think it's important that there's people that, you know, that is telling, you know, generations that maybe were born into the internet of how did we get here, because there are a lot of things that are important that maybe, you know, the story has not yet been crystallized and might be overlooked. Thank you very much for coming here, Susan.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for talking to me. Really a lot of fun.
Thank you.